Tonight, let's settle in and spend some time with the hidden world of underground queer spaces. Welcome back to Queer History for Sleep. Tonight, we're going to spend some quiet time together exploring another corner of LGBTQ+ history. Before we begin, if you enjoy cozy bedtime stories and LGBTQ+ history, I'd really appreciate it if you'd like this video and subscribe. And if you enjoy tonight's story, I'll be back tomorrow night with the next episode in this series. Every episode on this channel is carefully researched, and you'll find the full source list for tonight's episode in the description below. Now get comfortable, and let's begin. There is a particular kind of knowledge that gets passed from person to person in a whisper. Not a secret in the dramatic sense, not a spy's secret, not a lover's secret, but something quieter and more practical than that. The kind of knowledge that travels through a community because the community has no other way to keep itself alive. The kind of thing you learn when someone leans close to you at a party and says, very quietly, that there's a place on Christopher Street, that it's down a few steps from the sidewalk, that you'll know it by the blacked out windows, that you shouldn't go alone the first time, and that when you get there, you don't use your real name. This is a story about those whispers. It is a story that moves slowly, because the years it covers moved slowly and heavily, under the weight of laws that pressed down on people's daily lives, on their choices, on the most ordinary decisions they made when they got dressed in the morning or decided where to go on a Saturday night. It is a story about patience that was not chosen, about endurance that was not a virtue so much as a necessity, about community that was built not from abundance but from scarcity. And it is a story, ultimately, about a warm summer night when something broke open, when all of that patience and endurance and careful, practiced, necessary hiding cracked along a fault line that nobody had quite seen coming, least of all the people who lived through it. It's a story about what it means to build a life in hidden spaces, what it costs, what it gives back, and what happens when the people living in the dark finally, one warm summer night, in 1969, step into the light. But we're going to take our time getting there. Because the story of Stonewall, of that particular building at 51 to 53 Christopher Street, in Greenwich Village, New York, is really a story about everything that came before it. Everything that made it necessary. Everything that shaped the people who walked through its armored door on an ordinary night in June. So let's go back. Let's go back much further than 1969. Let's begin with the world that existed before the uprising. The legal world, the social world, the daily lived world of people who had learned to navigate their lives around a set of rules that most Americans didn't even know existed. Because you can't understand what happened on Christopher Street without understanding what kind of landscape people were moving through in the years and decades that led up to that night. And to understand that landscape, we need to begin with a word. There is a word that appears again and again in the legal and social history of LGBTQ+ Americans in the middle of the 20th century. The word is disorderly. It's worth sitting with that word for a moment. Disorderly. Say it slowly. Disorderly. It suggests chaos. It suggests a disruption of some established peace. It suggests that something has gone wrong, that an arrangement has been broken, that the natural order of things has been disturbed. You can almost hear, in the sound of the word itself, a kind of bristling disapproval. The sense that something proper and settled has been upset by the presence of something that shouldn't be there. But in the legal vocabulary of New York City in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, the word disorderly had a very specific operational meaning. It meant the presence of homosexuals, not fighting, not property damage, not theft or assault or any of the things we usually mean when we talk about disorder. Just the presence of certain kinds of people in a space. That was enough. That was disorderly. The mere fact of their being there, of their gathering, of their sitting on bar stools and ordering drinks and talking to one another. That was the disruption of order that the law had in mind. The New York State Liquor Authority, the SLA, held enormous power over the social life of New York City. They issued licenses. They could revoke them. And they had decided, in their institutional wisdom, that any establishment that permitted LGBTQ+ people to gather on its premises was an establishment that could be classified as disorderly. The language of the law didn't always say this explicitly. There was no statute that read, in plain text, "You may not serve homosexuals." Instead, the SLA exercised what they called broad discretion. They could look at the clientele of an establishment and determine, based on who was there, how they dressed, how they spoke, who they danced with, whether the place was, in their judgment, disorderly. And if it was disorderly, the license went away. Think for a moment about what that meant in practice. Think about what it meant for the person who owned the establishment, who had invested money, time, the ordinary labor of building a business. To have that business potentially erased, not because of anything they had done wrong, not because any customer had been harmed, not because any law had been broken in any of the ways that laws are usually broken, simply because the wrong kind of person had come through the door. This is a quiet kind of power, but it is a devastating one. Because a bar without a liquor license is not a bar, and a community without a bar, a community without any physical space where it can gather, can speak, can simply exist in the presence of others, is a community that has been scattered to the wind. The SLA's power to apply this label, this word disorderly, to any establishment that opened its doors to gay and lesbian customers meant, in practice, that no legitimate business could afford to do so. It meant that the community was pushed, systematically, deliberately, by the weight of law and institutional authority, into hiding. And I want you to really hold the completeness of that. The hiding was complete. Not a situation where gay and lesbian New Yorkers had to be slightly careful about where they went, had to be a bit discreet in certain neighborhoods or certain hours of the day. Not mild social inconvenience. The kind of thing you could navigate around if you were clever, if you knew the right places, if you had enough money or the right connections. A landscape in which virtually every aspect of public social life, every bar, every restaurant, every dance hall, every place where people gathered to be with other people, was legally inaccessible. A bartender who knowingly served a gay customer was, under 1960s state law, potentially committing an offence. The mere act of serving someone a drink, in a bar you had paid to operate, with a license you had applied for and received. That act could cost you everything if the wrong kind of person was sitting on the other side of the bar. not because of anything that customer had done, simply because of who they were. That's worth sitting with, even in the quietness of getting ready for sleep. The legal structure was built to make ordinary life impossible, not to punish specific acts, to make the daily, ordinary, unremarkable fact of being gay or lesbian a condition that could not be accommodated within the normal functioning of social life. And perhaps what's most important to understand about the SLA's power in this era is how completely it reshaped the geography of social possibility. When we talk about bars and restaurants and dance halls and this was just one layer of a much larger system. The clothing laws were visible and strange and specific, but they were only one expression of a broader legal and institutional reality that permeated almost every dimension of daily life for gay and lesbian Americans. In this era, in the late 1940s, a wave of paranoia swept through American political life. A paranoia that was ostensibly about communism, about the infiltration of American institutions by foreign ideologies and foreign agents, about the security of a nation that had just emerged from the Second World War and was now locked in a new kind of struggle with the Soviet Union. Senator Joseph McCarthy gave his name to this era, and the particular shape of the fear and the particular methods of persecution that characterized it. But the specific targeting of gay and lesbian federal employees had its own name, one that has sometimes gotten less attention than it deserves: the Lavender Scare. Between 1947 and 1950, just 3 years, a span of time that feels almost casual when you write it down, but that must have felt like an eternity to the people living through it. The national security apparatus of the United States denied approximately 1,700 federal job applications to people who were suspected of being homosexual. And that was just the beginning. Over the same period, more than 4,000 people were discharged from the military for the same reason. 4,000 people. The number carries a weight that is hard to fully register from a distance. The cumulative total of 4,000 individual lives disrupted, careers ended, futures foreclosed. 4,000 people who had served or attempted to serve their country and who were turned away or pushed out, not because of anything they had done, but because of who they were. The reasoning, on its surface, was about security risks. Gay and lesbian people, the thinking went, were vulnerable to blackmail because their sexuality was a secret they needed to keep. And if they were being blackmailed by foreign agents, they might compromise national security. This argument had a certain circular cruelty to it that is worth naming clearly. The government was creating the conditions under which homosexuality needed to be kept secret, making it shameful, making it dangerous, making it something that cost you your job and your freedom if it was known, and then using the secrecy as justification for further persecution. The secret had to be kept because the government would punish you if it got out. And the fact that you were keeping a secret proved that you were a security risk. Therefore, you should be punished more severely, which made the secret more necessary to keep, which made you a greater security risk. The logic ate itself, but the power behind it was real. The Lavender Scare had a particularly corrosive effect because of the specific nature of the argument being made against gay and lesbian people. In other forms of persecution, in other historical moments when groups of people were targeted by the state, The targeting at least proceeded from a set of accusations about what those people had done, or what they might do. The Lavender Scare targeted people for what they were, not for any act, not for any specific behavior, simply for being the kind of person they were. And the argument about security risk, the blackmail argument, was particularly insidious because it made the persecution self-justifying. Here is the logic. Gay people can be blackmailed because they must hide their sexuality. They must hide their sexuality because exposure will cost them everything. Exposure will cost them everything because we will take everything from them if they are exposed. Therefore, they are security risks. Therefore, we should expose them, which costs them everything, which makes them hide, which makes them vulnerable to blackmail. The machinery turned and turned on itself and produced, at each revolution, more persecution and more reason for more persecution. The people at the center of the machine had no exit that the machine would recognize. They could not declare themselves openly. The penalty for openness was the penalty the machine was designed to apply. They could not hide effectively enough, because the machine was designed to find them. They were caught. But beyond the policy mechanics, what the Lavender Scare communicated was something much simpler and much more devastating. Gay and lesbian people were not safe, not from their employers, not from their government, not from the institutions that were supposed to protect American citizens. If you were gay or lesbian in America in 1950, the message was very clear. You were unwanted. You were suspected. You were a problem to be managed. And yet people built community. People found each other. People built lives. This is the thing that I find most remarkable about this history, and I want to linger here for a moment before we move on, before we begin making our way toward Christopher Street. Because it would be very easy to tell this story as a story of victimization, of a community crushed by law and prejudice, hiding in the dark, surviving on scraps of social life, in spaces that were barely legal and often exploitative. And that story is true. The crushing was real. The darkness was real. But the community building was also real. And it was extraordinary. And it deserves to be understood on its own terms, not just as a backdrop for what came later, not just as the difficult setting against which the uprising eventually occurred. People found each other. In the face of everything designed to keep them from finding each other, they found each other. That is not a small thing. In 1950, at the height of the McCarthy era, when the Lavender Scare was actively dismantling the careers and lives of gay and lesbian Americans, a small group of gay men in Los Angeles founded an organization called the Mattachine Society, named after a medieval group of itinerant performers who always wore masks, who moved through public life, always hidden behind a face that wasn't their own. The Mattachine Society was one of the first sustained efforts in American history to organize gay people as a political community. The name itself was a kind of code. Medieval masked performers. Hidden identity. The choice of name was both a description of the organization's own situation, operating in public under a kind of mask, its true purpose not fully visible to outsiders, and an acknowledgement of something deeper, that gay and lesbian people had always, in one way or another, worn masks in public, that the mask was not a disguise chosen at a particular political moment, but a survival strategy with a very long history. The founders of the Mattachine Society knew what they were doing, and they knew what it might cost. They were organizing at a moment when the federal government was actively seeking out and removing gay people from positions of influence and employment. They were building a structure that, if found by hostile forces, would expose everyone in it. They were choosing to create something that documented itself, that had meetings and minutes and membership, in an era when documentation was dangerous. They built it anyway. They met in people's homes. They talked about who they were and what they deserved and what kind of world they wanted to live in. And from those conversations, in living rooms in Los Angeles, came an organization that would eventually have chapters in cities across the country, that would publish materials and organize events and represent the community in conversations with politicians and journalists and institutions. And that would be one of the foundations on which everything that came later was built. 5 years later, in 1955, a group of lesbians in San Francisco founded the Daughters of Bilitis, named after a collection of erotic poems by Pierre Louis, a name obscure enough to be safely used in correspondence without raising immediate suspicion. If you were not already familiar with Lewis's work, the name suggested perhaps a women's club with some sort of historical or literary theme. It did not suggest, to an outside eye, what it actually was. The naming decision for the Daughters of Bilitis is its own small story worth sitting with. The founders needed a name that would allow them to exist publicly, to have a name by which the organization could be referred to, by which mail could be addressed, by which people could ask each other if they'd heard of this group, without immediately flagging what the organization was. A coded name was not a lie. Exactly. It was a protective layer. It was the organizational equivalent of signing the logbook as Judy Garland. It was a way of existing in the public record while maintaining just enough plausible distance from full legibility to operate safely. The Daughters of Bilitis began as a social club, a place where lesbian women could simply be with one another, could gather, could talk, could share a meal or a conversation in a space that was, for once, oriented toward their lives and their experiences. It evolved over time into one of the earliest lesbian political organizations in the country. But even in its earliest days, as simply a social club, it was doing something that had enormous value. It was creating a space where people could exist without performing the version of themselves that the outside world required. These organizations operated in conditions of, what did it feel like to live in this world? I think about this. I think about it as I look at the photographs that do survive. The rare, carefully taken, often blurry photographs of underground spaces from this era, the faces in them usually turned away from the camera or softened by shadow. I think about the weight that the people in those photographs were carrying. I think about the specific textures of daily life under these conditions. The Sunday dinners with family, where certain topics never came up. The office Christmas parties, where you brought a friend of the appropriate gender and performed a particular kind of ordinariness for colleagues who might or might not have suspected anything. The friendships maintained across two separate registers. The friendship as it existed in public, and the friendship as it existed in private, which were sometimes almost entirely different things. The energy required to maintain these separations was constant and largely invisible, even to the people doing it. You don't notice the effort of managing yourself. When you've been doing it so long, it's become automatic. The effort is always there, humming along beneath the surface of every interaction, every conversation, every decision about what to say and how to say it and what to leave out. It's only when the management stops, when you step into a room where you don't have to do it anymore, that you feel the weight of it by feeling its absence. What was it like to navigate everyday life carrying this knowledge? That there was a version of yourself that couldn't exist in public, that the person you were at home, or with close friends, or in the spaces where you felt safe, was a person who had to be carefully concealed everywhere else. That you moved through your professional life, and your family life, and your civic life, wearing a kind of mask, not made of plaster, or cloth like the Mattachine Society's medieval performers, but made of language and posture, and the careful management of how you looked at people, and who you talked about, and what you said and didn't say. There's a psychological weight to that. It doesn't just create practical difficulties, though it does create those. The constant vigilance, the constant calculation about what to say and what to leave out. It does something more fundamental. It shapes the way you understand yourself. It teaches you that your authentic self is a liability, that visibility is danger, that being seen is something to be managed rather than celebrated. And that lesson, once learned, is not easily unlearned. Even in private moments, even in the underground spaces where you were, theoretically, free to be yourself, you carried the long habit of self-concealment. You had practiced it so long it had become automatic, the hand that starts to reach across the table and then pulls back, the sentence that begins and then changes direction, the laughter that's always slightly held back, because loud laughter attracts attention. And yet, again, and yet, people carried this and still built lives of real warmth and connection and meaning. They found each other in the dark, and they made the dark feel a little less dark. The Saturday night apartments happened. The careful newsletters arrived in plain envelopes. The whispers travelled. The community that had no official address found itself, somehow, every week, in back rooms and borrowed spaces and half-hidden doorways. The spaces they found, the bars, the clubs, the private gatherings, were imperfect. They were often operated by people who didn't have their best interests at heart, who saw in the community a captive market rather than a community of human beings, deserving of dignity and decent treatment. They were surveilled by police, who sometimes used the underground spaces as opportunities for harassment, for arrest, for extortion of their own. They were raided. They were temporary, always one bad night away from disappearing. But they were there. And they were, for the people who depended on them, everything. This is the world into which the Stonewall Inn was born. Hidden community doesn't build itself by accident. It doesn't happen easily. And the way it was built tells you a great deal about the ingenuity and resilience of the people who built it. And the people who built it, it's worth noting, were not always the same as the people who sustained it. The mechanics of survival in the underground involved many different actors with many different motivations. And understanding those mechanics is part of understanding how a particular bar on Christopher Street came to be what it was. The first challenge is simply the problem of finding. How do you find a space that doesn't appear on any map, that has no sign, that keeps its windows blacked out and its doors locked to strangers? How does knowledge of that space spread through a community when the community has no safe public channels, no newspaper it can use openly, no radio program, no public bulletin board? The answer is through whisper networks, through trust, through the careful, gradual expansion of a circle of people who know. You told one person. You told them because you knew them, because you trusted them, because you had some sense, from the way they talked, or the way they laughed, or the way they looked at certain people. That they were part of this community, that they needed what you needed, that this knowledge would mean something to them. You told them, and they understood immediately what it meant. And they thanked you with a quietness that told you that this was something they'd needed to hear. There is something intimate about that kind of knowledge transfer. It is not the passing of information between people who have a purely functional relationship. It is an act of trust, an act of recognition. You are telling someone something that says, I see you. I understand who you are. I believe you are safe enough to receive this. The whisper that carried the knowledge of underground spaces was also a whisper that said, you are not alone. There are others. There is somewhere to go. They told someone else. And that someone else had already told 3 more people. And one of those 3 people had been coming to the space for 2 years, and they vouched for you. And suddenly, you were in a circle of knowledge that you could not have found any other way. The circle was fragile, and it was also real. It was made of nothing more substantial than trust, which is to say, it was made of everything. The underground ran on trust. The whisper network ran on trust. The private clubs and the false names in the logbooks and the resupply logistics and the whole elaborate infrastructure of hidden social life. All of it depended, at every level, on the trust that held the community together. On people knowing who was safe, and believing that knowledge, and acting on it. Trust in a community that has been told, repeatedly and by many different institutions, that it does not deserve to be trusted. That is something. This system was slow, and it was fragile, and it depended on trust in a world where trust was a scarce commodity, where trust itself could be weaponized, where police sometimes sent undercover officers into the underground precisely to gather the names and habits of community members. The person you whispered to might, in the wrong circumstances, be someone who would repeat what you'd said to the wrong ears. But the system also had a certain resilience to it, because the same discretion that made it hard to find these spaces also made it hard for hostile forces to find them. If you didn't already know, you didn't find out. If you weren't already trusted by someone who was trusted, you didn't get access to the knowledge that told you where to look. The community that built these networks was practiced, deeply practiced, in the art of not being found, and that same practice protected the spaces those networks led to. The second challenge was the problem of legality, and the community, and the various people who operated spaces for the community, for better and worse motives, developed a series of operational workarounds that are worth understanding because they reveal something about the ingenuity of the underground. The most important of these was what we might call the private club fiction. Here's how it worked. The New York State Liquor Authority had authority over establishments that sold liquor to the public. That authority was broad and, as we've seen, actively hostile to gay and lesbian gatherings. But a private club, an association of members, a space that served its own membership rather than the general public, operated under different rules. members of a private club could, theoretically, bring their own liquor. And the club itself, being private rather than public, fell outside the SLAs. But there's a darker dimension to all of this, and I don't want to skip past it. Because the people who provided the logistical framework for underground queer social life in New York, who organized the private clubs, who managed the resupply logistics, who paid the bribes that kept the police at bay long enough for a Friday night to proceed, were not, for the most part, members of the community they were serving. They were organized crime. The mafia's involvement in underground queer spaces in New York City is a complicated and troubling piece of this history, and it deserves careful attention. It is not a comfortable piece of the story. It complicates any simple narrative about the underground as a pure expression of community resilience. But it is the truth of what was happening, and the truth matters. The involvement happened, in large part, because organized crime already operated in the spaces where illegal activity occurred. Bars that operated outside the law, unlicensed or operating under fraudulent licenses, were exactly the kind of enterprise that organized crime was equipped to run. They understood bribery. They had established relationships with the police precincts that would be involved in any enforcement action. They understood the management of risk in an illegal business environment. They understood how to run a business in a hostile regulatory environment while keeping authorities at bay. They had done all of this before, for other communities and other kinds of illegal goods and services. The underground queer bars were, from a certain angle, simply one more application of a set of skills and a set of relationships that organized crime already possessed. And the underground queer bars were, from a certain angle, simply good business. The community that frequented these spaces was captive. They had nowhere else to go. Demand was high and stable. The people who came through those doors were, in many cases, desperate for the social outlet the bar provided, desperate enough to accept whatever conditions were imposed on them, desperate enough not to complain about the price of a drink, or the quality of the facilities, or the way they were treated by management. Because what was the alternative? Leave? Yes. And go where? Go to a bar that would serve you without legal cover? There were no such bars. Go home and spend the evening alone. That was always an option, but human beings are social creatures, and the need for connection, for the simple experience of being in a room with other people who understood who you were, is not so easily set aside. This captivity was enormously profitable. The economics were simple and brutal. Admission fees of $1 on weekdays and $3 on weekends. With the volume that these spaces could generate, dozens, sometimes hundreds of people on a busy night, the numbers added up fast. On a good Saturday night, a single underground bar could gross as much as $6,500. In 1969 dollars. That is an enormous amount of money for a space that cost almost nothing to operate. The rent on the Stonewall Inn's space was approximately $300 a month. The space had been purchased outright for $3,500. The overhead was minimal. The profit was not. And then there were the bribes. The underground bar operators in New York maintained a corrupt but functionally stable relationship with local police precincts. The arrangement was not secret, in any meaningful sense. It was simply not spoken of in certain official contexts. The Stonewall Inn operating in the territory of the NYPD's 6th Precinct, paid approximately $1,200 a month in cash, $1,200 every month, to keep the police from shutting them down entirely. $1,200 a month. Think about that number for a moment. It was a significant sum in 1969, the equivalent of many thousands of dollars in today's money. It was enough that it represented a real business expense, a recurring cost that had to be factored into the economics of operating the space. It was enough that its payment represented a genuine investment in the continuation of the business, and it's worth sitting with what it meant, in human terms. The community that depended on underground spaces, like the Stonewall Inn, the community that had been pushed out of every legal venue by the SLA's disorderly regulations, was now paying, indirectly, through the cover charges and drink prices they paid to the bar, to bribe the police into merely harassing them rather than destroying the spaces they depended on. They were paying for the right to exist in the only spaces available to them. They were paying their exploiters for the privilege of being. Before we move on from these years of enforced hiding, I want to spend a moment on a few moments of resistance that were already happening in the decade before 1969, because the Stonewall Inn didn't emerge in isolation. The uprising that happened there happened in a community that had already begun, slowly and incrementally, to push back. The particular people who were at the Stonewall Inn on the night of June 28th had already been shaped by everything that came before. In 1959, in Los Angeles, there was the Cooper Do Nuts riot. Cooper Do Nuts was a 24-hour diner, the kind of place that attracts people who have nowhere else to be at, 3 a.m. That keeps its lights on through the hours when most other establishments have locked their doors. Its clientele at those late hours included drag queens, gay men, trans women, and sex workers. People who were regulars at this particular diner because this particular diner didn't turn them away, didn't ask uncomfortable questions, didn't call anyone to report that the wrong kind of person was on the premises. It was an informal refuge of the kind that existed in many cities. A 24-hour place that operated on a kind of unspoken policy of not looking too closely, not asking too much, letting the late-night crowd be the late-night crowd. The diner was not a political space, was not organized around any particular stance or mission. It was simply a diner that stayed open and served coffee and didn't make a problem out of who came through the door. And that was enough. In a landscape where almost every formal institution was hostile, an informal institution that simply did not participate in that hostility was a haven. The threshold for being a safe space in this era was not high. You didn't have to be welcoming in any active or affirmative sense. You just had to not call the police. When police came in one night to make arrests, the crowd fought back. They threw coffee cups and donuts at the officers. The police retreated. It was small. It was local. It was barely reported at the time. The mainstream press had little interest in covering what happened at a 24-hour diner in the small hours of the morning, when the clientele was the kind of people the mainstream press didn't particularly acknowledge. But it happened, and the people who were there knew it happened. And that knowledge moved through the community in the way that all such knowledge moved. Through whisper networks, through person-to-person telling, through the gradual spread of a story that mattered to people who needed it to matter. Resistance was possible. That was what the story said. That was what people took from it when they heard it.
The Cooper Donuts riot left almost no official trace. It was not covered extensively in newspapers. It did not give rise to organizations or legal cases or any of the documented institutional history that we usually think of as making something officially historical. It happened, and then it was over, and the diner went back to being a diner, and the people who had been there went back to their lives. But it was real, and the people who were there carried it with them. And when they told the story to someone else, at 3 a.m, over coffee, in some other late-night space, they were putting something into the community's collective sense of itself. We have done this before. It has been done. It can be done again. In 1966, in San Francisco, there was the Compton's Cafeteria riot. The Compton's Cafeteria in the Tenderloin district was another late-night gathering place for people who had nowhere else to be. Trans women, drag queens, gay men, hustlers, people who navigated the margins of the city's margins. Compton's had been calling police to remove undesirable customers. Not for any particular offence, not for any specific behaviour. For simply being there, for simply being the kinds of people they were. The management had decided that the presence of these customers was itself a problem to be managed, and the management of that problem was to call the police. One night, when an officer grabbed a trans woman's arm, grabbed it to drag her out, to remove her from the space she'd been sitting in, she threw her coffee in his face, and then the room erupted. People threw dishes, people broke windows, people overturned tables. When the police pushed everyone outside, someone broke out the glass door of the diner. Someone set a police car on fire. The block became, for a brief and vivid hour, a place where the people who had been subject to the management and the removal were doing the disrupting. This was 3 years before Stonewall. 3 years before the events on Christopher Street that the world came to know as.
Let's go back to 51 to 53 Christopher Street. And let's understand what was there before the Genovese crime family ever bought the shuttered restaurant for $3,500 in 1967. The buildings have a long history, and the history is, in its way, a small biography of New York City's constant reinvention of itself. The way the city is always becoming something else, always absorbing a new use into a space that used to serve a different purpose, always finding in its old bones some new way to be inhabited. In 1843, a man named A. Voorhis built a structure at what would become 51 Christopher Street. It was a horse stable, the kind of utilitarian, double-height building you needed if you were going to keep horses in a city that ran on horsepower. A city in which the movement of goods and people depended on the strength of animals, in which horses were infrastructure as surely as roads or bridges. The stable served a practical purpose in a practical city, and it was built accordingly. Sturdy, utilitarian, designed not for beauty, but for function. 3 years later, in 1846, a man named Mark Spencer built a similar structure next door, at what would become 53 Christopher Street, also for use as a stable. 2 stable buildings, side by side, in a neighborhood that was, in 1846, still being built up, still finding its character, still figuring out what it would eventually become. The 2 buildings stood side by side for decades, serving the practical needs of a city in motion. By 1898, the building at number 51 had been expanded upward to 3 stories, a renovation that created the height disparity between the two buildings that you can still see today if you stand on Christopher Street and look at them. The asymmetry of the two buildings, one taller, one shorter, side by side, is visible in photographs of the Stonewall Inn taken at any point in its history, and it's a legacy of these very early architectural decisions made in the 1890s in a building that was still just a stable. Then the city changed, as cities do. The horse gave way to the automobile. The stable became obsolete. The buildings that had been built for one purpose found themselves in a city that no longer had a use for that purpose, and they were adapted, as buildings often are, to serve new needs in a new urban moment. In 1914, the building at number 53 transitioned to commercial use as a bakery, operated by a man named Baptiste Yicre, a bakery in what had been a stable, the building absorbing a new smell, a new rhythm of work, the early hours when the bread went in and the later hours when it came out. The city, ever practical, ever improvising. The buildings continued to evolve, repurposed, renovated, worn down, and rebuilt by successive owners, responding to successive moments in New York's endless becoming. The most consequential transformation in the building's pre-Stonewall history came in 1930, when an architect named William Bayard executed a significant redesign for the building's owner, a man named Henry J. Harper. This was an arts and crafts redesign, a style that was having a certain vogue at the time, emphasizing craftsmanship and natural materials, and a kind of handmade aesthetic that pushed back against industrial uniformity, that found value in the texture of plaster and wood and stone, rather than in the smooth surfaces of mass production. Bayard removed the third story from number 51, bringing it back down to 2 stories, returning it closer to the height of its neighbour, and reclad both buildings in stucco. The stucco facade that resulted is still the most recognisable feature of 51 to 53 Christopher Street today. If you've seen photographs of the Stonewall Inn, and most people who know anything about LGBTQ+ history have, you've seen Bayard's 1930 work. You've seen the facade he applied when these buildings were just 2 commercial properties on a Greenwich Village street, years before anyone would have had any reason to care about them at all. Stucco is a particular kind of material. It's plaster-based, applied wet to a surface, and then textured or smoothed as it dries. It's a very old building material. People have been applying stucco to walls for thousands of years, and it creates a surface that is at once substantial and slightly rough to the touch, that holds shadow in its texture, that ages differently than brick or glass. The stucco that Bayard applied in 1930 has a particular quality in photographs, matte and slightly irregular, catching light in an uneven way that gives the facade a handmade quality. That facade is what you see from Christopher Street. That is the face the building turns toward the world, and behind it, over the nearly 100 years since Bayard applied it, the walk toward the building from the street, and you see, immediately, that the windows tell you nothing. They're blacked out, not tinted, not frosted, not the kind of treatment that suggests a business that simply wants a bit of privacy, or is keeping out the afternoon glare. Blacked out, covered over completely, sealed against the outside world, as if the interior of the building is something that must not be visible from the street under any circumstances. The windows of the Stonewall Inn are not windows in any functional sense. They are simply blank surfaces in a facade, holes in the wall that have been filled with darkness. And if you look carefully, you can see that they've been reinforced with 2x4 lumber, bars of wood across the glass that would slow down any police officer who tried to smash through from outside. Someone has thought about this building the way you think about a bunker. What would it take for this building to hold? What would it take to buy the people inside a few extra minutes when the moment came? The front doors are armoured. Steel plates have been added to them. The weight of them is perceptible when you push. Someone has thought about this too. Not the casual, impermanent security of a building that hopes not to be targeted, but the deliberate, heavy, invested security of a building that knows it will be targeted and is trying to make that targeting cost something. You come to the door and you stop. There's a peephole in the heavy wooden door. Someone on the other side is looking at you. They are making a decision. They are measuring you against their internal understanding of who belongs here and who doesn't, who is safe and who might be a problem. If you're recognized, or if you're with someone who's recognized, or if some quality about you communicates that you are what this place is for, the door opens. If not, you wait. If you seem like a problem, if you seem like a police officer, or a journalist, or simply someone who has wound up at the wrong door by accident, you don't get in. This moment, the moment at the peephole, is worth lingering on. It is one of the most charged moments in the whole geography of the underground. The brief pause before the door opens, the awareness that someone is looking at you and deciding whether you belong, the awareness that your admission to this space, to this refuge, to this few hours of being yourself, depends on passing an assessment made by a stranger looking through a hole in a door. It is a moment that encapsulates something about what the underground always was. Conditional, gate-kept, dependent on someone else's judgment about whether you were the right kind of person. Even in a space that existed to serve the most marginalized, there was still a door, and a peephole, and a stranger making a decision. There was also the particular quality of the wait itself, standing outside a door that is closed to you, that shows you nothing, that gives no sign, not a sign indicating what the place is, not a sign indicating whether it's open, not even a name on the door that you could point to as a reason for being there if someone asked. Standing there waiting is a particular experience. The street is behind you, and you are aware of the street. You are aware of anyone who might be watching from the street. You are aware that you are standing at the door of an unmarked building at a late hour, and that your reasons for being there are not things you can explain easily to a passing police officer. You stand there and you wait, and you don't look behind you too often, and you try to seem like someone who is simply waiting, not someone who is waiting for something in particular, not someone whose presence at this particular door, at this particular hour, means what it means. And then the door opens, and then you're inside. Just inside the doorway, there's what regulars called a wishing well, a decorative fixture near the entrance, a small, whimsical touch in an otherwise utilitarian space. It's the kind of detail that suggests someone, somewhere in the design process, had a sense of humour, or at least an awareness that you can't build a place entirely out of fear. You have to give people something to smile at when they come in. You have to offer them something that communicates welcome, warmth, the small assurances that this is a place where people can relax a little. The wishing well is a small gesture, but small gestures matter in spaces that have almost nothing else to offer. You sign the log. Or rather, you sign a name in the log. Donald Duck, maybe. Or Judy Garland. The pen is handed to you, and you understand immediately what's expected. A name, any name, the name of your choosing. You're a member now. Welcome to the club. The teenagers were here. Some of them were kids who lived in the streets or in the park. Christopher Park, the small triangular park across from the bar. Because their families had thrown them out, or they'd run away, or they'd simply aged out of whatever system was supposed to hold them. The situation of LGBTQ plus youth in this era was particularly desperate. The systems designed to support young people, family, school, social services, were almost universally hostile to them. Young gay or lesbian or trans people who were not able to conceal themselves completely often found themselves expelled from these systems entirely. And when that happened, when the family home was no longer an option, when school had become impossible, when the ordinary scaffolding of a young person's life had been pulled away, where did you go? You went to the park. You went to the places that were open late and didn't look too closely at who was coming through the door. The Stonewall Inn admitted them. The older patrons sometimes bought them drinks. It wasn't always a healthy or uncomplicated situation. A bar in 1969 was not an ideal social service for homeless teenagers, but it was the situation that existed. These kids had a place to be, and this was it. The drag queens were here. And when I say drag queens, I want to use the language of the era carefully, because terminology has shifted considerably in the decades since 1969, and the people I'm describing deserve to be described accurately. What we might today call transgender women, non-binary people, or gender non-conforming individuals were often, in the language of the late 1960s, referred to as transvestites, or described as people who wore drag. These terms carry different connotations now than they carried then, and the community of people they described was itself diverse. There were people for whom their gender presentation was part of an identity they understood in one way, and people who understood it differently, and people who had no language at all for what they were because the language didn't yet exist. The people I'm describing were people who lived, partly or fully, outside the gender binary, who presented themselves in ways that defied the gender norms of the era, who were among the most visible and therefore the most vulnerable members of the community. They were visible because they couldn't be otherwise, or wouldn't be otherwise, or because the cost of invisibility had simply become too high. They couldn't do the thing that the suits and ties crowd in the front room had done, couldn't modulate their presentation to something that passed, that flew under radar, that survived casual scrutiny on the street, or a glance from a police officer. They showed up as themselves, and for that, they bore a disproportionate share of police harassment, of violence, of arrest. If you were visibly gender non-conforming in New York in 1969, you were stopped by police more often. You were arrested more often. The 3 pieces of conforming clothing law was applied to you more aggressively, more frequently, with less latitude for ambiguity. You moved through the city at greater personal risk than almost anyone else in the community. The journey to the bar, the walk to Christopher Street, the arrival at the door, the wait at the peephole, was for these patrons different from what it was for people who could more easily pass. For them, the journey itself was a gauntlet. The possibility of being stopped on the street, of being subjected to the clothing inspection on the sidewalk before ever reaching the door, was real. The bar was a destination they had to survive the journey to. And yet, you showed up, and the back room of the Stonewall Inn was, in significant part, where you showed up, where you could be what you were, where the music played and the light was low enough that the world outside felt temporarily far away. There is something in that, in the specific act of showing up, of making the journey and arriving at the door. That feels important. These were not people who arrived at the Stonewall Inn by accident, who wandered in because it was nearby and the evening was long. They came because this was the place, because this was the space where the particular version of themselves that the rest of the world did not welcome could exist for a few hours. The effort it took to get there was itself a form of insistence. I am here. I made the journey. I exist. Night after night, people made that journey. Night after night, people navigated to Christopher Street and stood at the door and waited for the peephole to decide they were safe. The regularity of it, the way the community reconstituted itself in this space, evening after evening, week after week, is its. And the bar therein is, I have to be honest about this, not a particularly pleasant place, by any standard measure. The physical conditions of the Stonewall Inn were, to put it gently, rough. They were rough in ways that would not have been tolerated in almost any other establishment, in ways that reflected the total captivity of the community that depended on this space. The captivity of people who had no alternatives, and who therefore could not demand better. The most striking detail, the one that stays with you once you've read it, is this. The bar had no running water. Not functioning, but poor running water. Not a leaky faucet or unreliable pipes. No running water at all, in any practical sense, that would have allowed the bar to operate cleanly. The bartenders washed glasses in rubber tubs, tubs of water that were changed infrequently, that accumulated the residue of dozens of glasses over the course of an evening, that became increasingly murky and unclean as the night wore on. Drink after drink, served in a glass that had been rinsed in water that was already doing double and triple and quadruple duty. That was more the memory of clean water than water itself. The rubber tubs sit at the centre of the Stonewall Inn's story as a kind of emblem, not of depravity, not of failure, but of the specific and concrete way that captivity was used against a community. The tubs were there because it was cheaper to have tubs than to fix the plumbing. The tubs were there because the community would come anyway. The tubs were there because someone had calculated, correctly, as it turned out, that the need for the space was strong enough to absorb even this, that the relief of being in the room would outweigh the grimness of what was in the glass. Every time someone ordered a drink at the Stonewall Inn, and it was handed to them in a glass that had been rinsed in murky tub water, the entire logic of the underground was present in that transaction. The exploitation and the refuge were both there in the glass. The captivity and the community were both there. And this wasn't just unpleasant to contemplate. It was a public health issue. 6 months before the uprising. So, approximately December 1968, in the middle of a winter in which people were coming out of the cold into this dark bar and ordering drinks in those glasses, there was a documented hepatitis outbreak among the Stonewall Inn's clientele. Multiple people got sick. And the dirty water in those rubber tubs was almost certainly a contributing factor. The mafia that operated this bar knew about these conditions. They chose not to fix them, because fixing them would have cost money, and the people who came to the Stonewall Inn had no other options. And when people have no other options, you don't have to maintain the facility. You don't have to clean the tubs. You don't have to fix the plumbing, because they'll come back anyway. The dirty rubber tubs are not a footnote. They are part of the story. They tell you something about what it meant to be pushed so far to the margins that even your right to a clean glass was contingent on someone else's profitability calculations. They tell you about the degree to which the community's physical well-being was simply not a consideration in the operation of the only spaces available to them. And yet, people kept coming. Because the alternative, the absence of this space, of this music, of this chance to be in a room with other people who understood who you were, was worse than the dirty tubs. The community made a calculation, consciously or not, and the calculation came out the same way every night. Here is better than not here. Now, let's talk about what an ordinary night at the Stonewall Inn actually looked like. Let's move through it slowly, from the moment someone arrived to the moment they left, letting the evening unspool, the way evenings unspool. Gradually, with its own rhythms and textures, and small moments that accumulate into the experience of having been somewhere, of having spent time in a particular place with particular people. The bar was usually busy. On weeknights, there was a steady flow of people, not packed, but populated, the comfortable hum of a place that has found its rhythm. On weekends, and especially on Friday and Saturday nights, the crowd pressed closer. The official capacity was roughly 175 people. But on busy nights, the actual number was higher because the crowd wasn't inclined to self-regulate, and the management wasn't inclined to care about fire codes. You came in. You signed the log. You found a spot at the bar, or near the jukebox, or somewhere in the back room, and you settled into the particular pleasure of being in this space. Not a luxurious. It is June 28th, 1969. It is 1:20 in the morning. The night is warm. It's summer in New York, and the city in summer is different from the city in other seasons. Warmer and louder and more alive in the particular way of cities that have opened their windows and their doors to let in the air, that have moved some portion of their social life onto stoops and sidewalks and the small triangular parks that interrupt the grid. Christopher Street is not quiet. It is not empty. The warm night has kept people out, and the block has a particular quality of lingering. People moving slowly, not ready to go in. 8 officers from the NYPD's Morals Division, working under the command of Inspector Seymour Pine, approach the Stonewall Inn. They are undercover. Or rather, some of them were undercover. There were plainclothes officers who had been inside the bar earlier in the evening, who had been moving through the space, gathering observations, building whatever operational picture they were building. The bar's management, presumably, did not know. The warning didn't come. And this is the first thing that's different about this particular night. There was no tip-off. The $1,200 a month arrangement with the 6th Precinct did not apparently include advance warning of this particular raid. Whether this was a breakdown in the corrupt arrangement, a failure somewhere in the network of relationships and payments that usually kept the bar informed, or a deliberate decision by Pine's unit to move outside the normal channels, to conduct a raid that the bar's management hadn't been tipped to in advance, or something else entirely. The precise reason has never been entirely established, but the result is clear. The white floodlights don't come on. There is no warning. There is no time for anyone to adjust, to compose themselves, to become the carefully managed version of themselves that the bar's rituals usually required. The police simply arrive. And because they arrive without warning, the scene they walk into is the full, unguarded truth of the Stonewall Inn on a busy Friday night. People are dancing. People are together. People are talking without monitoring what they say. People are, for once, not performing the version of themselves that the outside world required, because the signal that would have cued the performance didn't come. And so the performance hasn't started, and the room is simply what it is. A room full of people being themselves. The standard procedure begins. Officers move through the bar. They check IDs. They separate people who don't have ID, or who fail the gender inspection, or who are simply unlucky in the way that people are sometimes unlucky when authority moves through a space looking for reasons. A few of the bar's employees are placed under arrest. Some patrons are arrested. Those who have been arrested are escorted outside, to the street, to be loaded into the police wagon, waiting on Christopher Street. And here is where things begin to depart from the script. In previous raids, the arrested patrons had typically gone quietly, because going quietly was what you did, because making a scene was dangerous. It attracted more attention. It gave the police more reason to press down harder. It could turn a manageable situation into a worse one. Because the entire social system had been built around the understanding that when the police came, you cooperated. You minimized your losses. You got out of there, got to a lawyer if you had one or could find one, paid what needed to be paid, and started over. You did not fight back. Fighting back was not part of the arrangement. But this night, on Christopher Street, something different happens. It begins outside. As the arrested patrons are brought out of the bar, a crowd begins to gather on the sidewalk. This is itself somewhat unusual. Normally, people scattered when the police came. The normal response to police presence was dispersal, a movement away from the source of danger, the practiced invisibility of a community that had learned to make itself small when authority appeared. But tonight, people are watching, and then more people are watching. And then the crowd is significant, and it is not dispersing. The warm summer night has kept people on the street, and the people on the street have noticed what is happening, and they are not moving away from it. The specific catalyst, the thing that transforms a watching crowd into an active one, the thing that changes the quality of the energy from observation to something more charged and more dangerous, is a woman. She has never been conclusively identified. The accounts of the night describe her as a butch lesbian who had been arrested inside the bar. She is brought. The nights that followed kept that energy alive, though unevenly. June 29th. Hundreds of people returned to Christopher Street. The gay power graffiti was still on the walls. There were confrontations with police. There was a quality of claiming, of staking a presence on this block, in this neighborhood, on these streets, that hadn't existed the night before. People came back. They stood there. They didn't go away. Think about what it meant to come back. The night before had been unexpected, had happened without anyone planning for it, had carried the energy of something that broke through rather than something that was constructed. Coming back the next night was a choice, a deliberate, considered choice to return to the place where it had happened, to maintain the presence, to say, this wasn't a single night's aberration. We are still here. June 30th and July 1st. Rain dampened the activity somewhat, reduced the numbers on the street, muted some of the momentum, but it didn't extinguish it. The conversations that were happening, in apartments across the village, in other bars and cafes, in the neighborhood spaces where people gathered, were different from the conversations that had happened before. Something had shifted in the collective understanding of what was possible, what you could do, what you could be. The rain nights are important, actually. They tell you something about the nature of what was happening. If the uprising had been purely spontaneous, purely the product of a single explosive night, with no deeper roots, it would have faded when the practical conditions that sustained it changed. Rain would have ended it. Tiredness would have ended it. The re-establishment of routine police presence on Christopher Street would have ended it. But the rain came, and the numbers were smaller, but they were still there. The conversations kept going. July 2nd. A second major riot erupted in the village. The numbers were larger this time. Estimates suggest thousands of people in the streets. This was no longer a single bar's clientele responding to a single raid. This was a community responding to a moment, to the awareness that something had broken open and that they were in the middle of it. The expansion from hundreds to thousands in the space of a few days is worth pausing on. Where did the thousands come from? They came from the wider community, from people who had not been at the Stonewall Inn on June 28th, but who had heard, through the same whisper networks that had always served the community, what had happened there, who had heard that people on Christopher Street had refused to go quietly, and who had decided that they too were not going to go quietly. The news travelled the way community news had always travelled in the underground, person to person, in private, in the spaces where trust existed. The whisper network that had carried the location of the bar, the knowledge of how to find it, the information about which nights were better and which bartenders were kinder, and what to expect when the floodlights came on. That same network now carried the news of what had happened on June 28th. And the news moved fast, because this was news that people needed to hear. This was news that meant something to anyone who had spent time in the underground, anyone who had signed a fake name in a logbook, anyone who had felt the weight of the floodlights coming on and had composed themselves on command. It meant someone didn't compose themselves on command. It meant the crowd didn't scatter. It meant, on Christopher Street, on a warm June night, it happened differently. And people came to see what differently looked like, and what they found, when they arrived, was other people who had come for the same reason. And in that arriving together, the uprising expanded into something larger than any single night's defiance. July 3rd. The NYPD formally dispersed the final demonstrations. The uprising, in its active street phase, was over. 5 days. 5 nights. 5 days in which a community that had spent decades practicing invisibility decided to be visible. 5 days in which the underground came above ground, if only for a moment. 5 days that changed everything that came after. I want to sit with that for a moment. To really sit with it. To let it rest here in the quiet. Think about the specific people who were there on the night of June 28th, the teenager who lived in Christopher Park and had nowhere to sleep, the drag queen who had been navigating the gender inspection at the door for years, who had perfected the art of presenting just enough conformity to get through without being arrested, the butch woman who had been thrown out of other bars in the village that same night, and who had. After Stonewall, things moved quickly, at least by the standards of the way things usually move, by the standards of political and social change, which tends to move slowly, to grind against resistance, to take years or decades to accomplish what seems like it should have taken months. In the weeks immediately following the uprising, organizations began to form. The Gay Liberation Front was founded in July 1969, one of the first explicitly political organizations to emerge from the post-Stonewall moment, and one that deliberately connected LGBTQ plus liberation to broader struggles against racism, capitalism, and imperialism. It took a stance that was explicitly political in a way that the earlier homophile organizations had not always been. It named itself as a liberation movement, rather than a civil rights organization. It drew conscious connections between different forms of oppression. It expressed a willingness to be confrontational, rather than strategic. Shortly after, the Gay Activists Alliance formed, with a somewhat narrower focus on specifically gay and lesbian civil rights issues. A more targeted organization, more concerned with the mechanics of legal and political change within the existing system. Different from the Gay Liberation Front in its approach, and sometimes in tension with it, but part of the same explosion of organizational energy that the Stonewall Uprising had catalyzed. These organizations were different from the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis, the homophile organizations of the 1950s. Not necessarily better in every dimension. The older organizations had their own forms of courage and their own significant achievements, had operated in conditions that the newer organizations never had to face, quite so acutely. But different in their spirit, in their mode of being in public, in their relationship to visibility. The Mattachine Society had cultivated a careful, conservative, work within the system approach. It had been, by necessity, cautious. The new organizations that emerged after Stonewall were louder, more confrontational, more willing to make visible claims in public space, more willing to risk the kind of exposure that the homophile organizations had spent years carefully avoiding. The change in approach reflected a change in the understanding of what was possible. Something had shifted. The calculation that had always said visibility is danger was still true. Visibility did still carry risks. But it was no longer the only calculation available. The night of June 28th had demonstrated something that the architecture of oppression was designed to prevent anyone from knowing, that you could step into the street and survive. That visibility was survivable. June 28th, 1970. exactly 1 year after the uprising. Something that had never happened before in American history took place in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Chicago. Gay liberation marches. People walked through the streets, in public, in daylight, holding signs, making noise, claiming space, asserting their right to be seen. The Christopher Street Liberation Day. March in New York walked from the village uptown to Central Park. Hundreds of people. People who walked with their faces visible, whose names were, in some cases, attached to their presence there, who were making a claim that could be seen, and recorded, and not denied. And I think about what it must have felt like to be among those hundreds of people, walking uptown through Manhattan, to be walking in daylight through streets that were full of people who were not part of this march. Ordinary pedestrians, people going about their Saturday, people who might look at the march with curiosity, or hostility, or confusion, to be visible to all of them, to be a person claiming space in the most public possible way, in the city that had spent decades making it clear that you could not claim that kind of space. The march was the opposite of the peephole, the opposite of the blacked-out window, the opposite of the pseudonym in the logbook. It was the most direct possible refusal of everything the underground had required. It said, "We are here. You can see us. We are not going to disappear." And then, the next year, more hundreds. And then, the year after that, thousands. These marches were extraordinary, because they were the opposite of everything the underground had required. The underground had required invisibility, discretion, coded language, whisper networks, pseudonyms in logbooks. The march required visibility, declaration, legibility, presence. It required you to walk through the streets with your name on a banner and your face turned toward the sky. Or at least, not hidden. Not managed. Present. Not everyone could do this. And horse stables in 1843, a bakery in 1914, a restaurant in 1934, an underground bar in 1967, the site of an uprising in 1969, a historic district designation in April 1969, 2 months before any of this, based on a stucco facade and an architectural style, and the judgment of a committee doing its ordinary work. A National Register site in 1999. A National Historic Landmark in 2000. A City Landmark in 2015. A National Monument in 2016. A Visitor Centre in 2024. And still, next door, still a bar. Still open. Still a place where people can walk in through the door and have a drink, and be in the room where history was made. William Bayard's stucco facade is still there, from 1930. It has survived everything, the raids, and the riots, and the decades of neglect, and the designation, and the renovation, and the attention of the entire world. The facade that was granted historic protection in April 1969, the stucco that protected the building by accident before history made it famous, is still there. Still visible on Christopher Street. Still the outside of the building. There is something quietly beautiful about that. That the thing which was preserved first, preserved before anyone knew it needed preserving, was the outside of the building, the surface, the face that the building shows to the street. And inside, behind that facade, in the spaces that were built to be invisible, the history happened. I want to leave you with this image, and I want to linger on it for as long as we can before the night gets quiet. It's 1968, an ordinary night, not yet historic. a person finds their way to Christopher Street for the first time. Someone they trusted told them about this place. Not someone they knew well. Someone in a chain of people, each of whom knew someone else, each of whom extended the circle of knowledge one more link. They were told, there is a place. The windows are blacked out. You'll know it by that. They walk down Christopher Street. The night is warm, or the night is cold, and the city is doing what the city always does, which is to be itself, loud and indifferent, and full of people going in every direction. They pass the building once, looking for the number without looking like they're looking for it. They see the blacked out windows. They see the door. They see that the building gives nothing away. The building gives nothing away. That's important. There is no sign. There is no indication of what the building is or what goes on inside it. From the outside, you could not tell that this is a bar. You could not tell that this is a gathering place, a refuge, one of the most important spaces in a community's social life. The building is designed to be unreadable, and somehow, through whispers and chains of trust, this unreadable building has been found. They walk past. They come around the block. They approach the door again. They knock, or ring, or simply stand there and wait, and someone looks through the peephole and decides they're safe. The door opens. Inside, there is music. There is the murmur of conversation, the low, steady sound of many people talking, the particular texture of a room where people have settled into the evening, where the first drink nervousness has relaxed into something more comfortable. There is the jukebox playing. There is the low light, the black painted walls, the smell of the room, cigarette smoke, and bodies, and cheap drinks, and the particular smell of a room that has been used every night for years, and carries that use in it. There is the wishing well, just inside the door. They stand there for a moment. They let the door close behind them, and something shifts. They sign the logbook. They write a name that is not their name. They go in. And for the first time in a very long time, or perhaps for the first time ever, the first time in their adult life, the first time since they understood what they were and what that meant in the world they'd been born into, no one is watching them to see if they are the right kind of person. The room is full of people who are, in one way or another, the same kind of person. The same underground, the same whisper network, the same relief. The music plays. They stand in the room for a moment and just let it be what it is. They don't order a drink immediately. They don't move toward anyone or anything. They just stand there and feel the room around them, the music and the murmur and the low light and the smell and the simple, unremarkable, extraordinary fact of being in a room full of people who understand. There will be time for conversation, for a drink, for finding someone to talk to, or finding a spot near the jukebox. And listening. All of that will come. But first, just this. The moment of arrival. The moment of being. In the place after the journey to get there. They have, for a few hours, the rare and ordinary luxury of simply being where they are. That is what was built here, in this building, in all the buildings like it, all the hidden places, all the spaces that existed in the dark, that were maintained at cost, and sustained by need, and kept alive because the communities that depended on them had no alternative. That small, ordinary, extraordinary thing. A room where you could simply be. Not a perfect room. Not a safe room in any absolute sense. not a room with clean glasses or comfortable seats, or any of the amenities that people who had better options could take for granted. A room with dirty tubs and black walls and an armoured door and a system of floodlights for when the police came. But a room, a place, somewhere, and somewhere, for the people who needed it, was everything. It was worth building. It was worth protecting. It was worth, on one warm June night, refusing to let it be taken away. And now, it is history. And we remember it. We remember the whispers that spread the knowledge of its existence. We remember the woman who signed the logbook as Judy Garland, and the man who signed as Donald Duck, and the small, quiet defiance embedded in those names. We remember the white floodlights and what it felt like when they came on. We remember the people in the back room and the soul music playing. And we remember the night when the floodlights didn't come on, when the warning didn't arrive, when the script broke down and a woman in handcuffs refused to cooperate with it. We remember all of it. And now, let's close. Let's end where we began, with the whispers. I think about the people who first walked through the armoured door at 51 to 53 Christopher Street. Not in 1969, not the famous night, but in 1967 or 1968, on an ordinary night, on their first visit. Someone had told them. Someone had leaned close and said quietly that there was a place, that you went down some steps, that the windows were blacked out, that you signed a name in a log and it didn't have to be your real name. What did they feel, walking in for the first time? I think about this often. I try to imagine the specific quality of that first moment, crossing the threshold from the street into the interior, from the warm summer sidewalk into the dark enclosed air of the bar. I think they felt the relief that comes from being in a room where you don't have to manage yourself, where you don't have to monitor your face, your posture, your words, the distance between you and another person, the way you laugh, the way you look at someone, the specific calibration of everything you do and say, and are in the presence of the outside world, where the performance that ordinary life required, the continuous, exhausting, invisible, because it had become automatic performance of being a safe and acceptable version of yourself, could, for a few hours, be set down. That relief is not a small thing. For people who have carried that performance for years, the weight of it becomes invisible, part of the texture of daily life, not noticed until it's briefly absent. And then, in a room where it's briefly absent, you feel how much it has been weighing on you. You feel the weight of it by feeling its absence. And that feeling, that sudden awareness of how much you've been carrying, is overwhelming in the way that things are overwhelming when they're long overdue. The dirty tubs were real. The extortion was real. The raids were real. The danger was real. And the relief was also real. These two things are both true, and they don't cancel each other out. They existed simultaneously. The underground was an exploitation and a refuge simultaneously. It was built by people who didn't care about the community and sustained by the community's need. It was the worst option that was still an option, and it was enough. In the end, in the long arc of the story, the very long arc that runs from the horse stable of 1843 to the National Monument of 2016, it was enough. Because the community that kept showing up to sign their pseudonyms in logbooks, that kept coming back after raids, that kept whispering to each other about where to go and how to find it, that community was building something, not intentionally, not strategically, not with any plan in mind for where it would lead. Just by existing, by insisting on existing, by finding each other in the dark and choosing to stay. What does it mean that a building can become a national monument? Not just this building, any building. The designation of a physical place as a monument, as something that the nation has decided to protect and remember, is, at its heart, a statement about meaning, about which stories the nation has decided to keep, about which experiences, which struggles, which communities are considered important enough to be written into the permanent record of what has happened here, on this ground, in this city, in this country. For most of American history, the stories that got monumentalized were certain kinds of stories: battles, political leaders, events that were already understood as important when they happened, in spaces that were designed to receive significance, spaces built for ceremony and record, spaces that knew they would be remembered. The Stonewall Inn is different. It wasn't designed to receive significance. It was designed to hide. It was a building that existed precisely to be invisible, to leave no trace, to be the kind of place that didn't appear in newspapers or tourist guides or official records. The people inside it were people who had been told, systematically and repeatedly, that their stories didn't matter, that their existence was not worth preserving, that the best they could hope for was to be left alone. And then, on a June night, the people inside it did something that could not be ignored. Not because they planned to, not because they chose to make history in the deliberate way that people sometimes choose to act in historical moments, but because they were simply tired. Tired of being invisible, tired of performing, tired of paying for the right to exist in a space without running water. Tired, on this particular night, when the warning didn't come and the floodlights stayed off, of acting as though the arrangement made sense. A woman, in handcuffs, refused to go quietly, and everything that came after was built on that refusal. Consider what the people in that building, on that night, could not have known. They couldn't have known that the buildings had been given historic designation 2 months before, based on a stucco facade from 1930. They couldn't have known that their refusal to go quietly would eventually be recognized as the beginning of a movement that would transform the legal and social landscape of the country. They couldn't have known that the place where they had been gathering, the place they'd signed fake names to get into, the place where they'd watched the floodlights for warning, the place where they'd drunk from glasses washed in murky water, would one day be where the President of the United States would come to designate a national monument. They didn't know any of that. They just knew that on this night, the script had broken down, and they didn't feel like following it anymore. And then, later, after the police came, and the police left, and the bottles were thrown, and the pennies were thrown, and the night was over, and the sun came up on Christopher Street, they had lost the wounded look. Not all at once, not completely, not permanently, perhaps, for any individual who carries within them the very long history of having learned to make themselves small. But something had shifted. The careful, permanent management of one's own visibility. The posture of someone who has learned to disappear on command was a little less automatic than it had been the night before. That shift is not a small thing. For individuals who carry it, and for a community that begins to understand itself differently, that shift is everything. The underground didn't disappear after Stonewall. Plenty of people still needed it, still depended on it, still navigated their lives through whisper networks and coded signs, and carefully managed invisibility. The world didn't change overnight. It has not fully changed yet, and this is perhaps the most important thing to hold on to as we close. The underground was not something that ended in 1969. It was not a chapter that closed. It continued, and continues, to be the reality for many LGBTQ+ people in many places, in countries where the laws are far more punishing than what New York had in the 1960s, in communities where the social costs of visibility are too high to bear, in families where the closet is still the safest option. The underground is not history in the sense of something past. It is history in the sense of something that shaped us, and that continues to shape people in places that are less far along than we might wish. The Stonewall Inn's National Monument designation is not the end of the story. It is a marker in a story that is still being told, in many different voices, in many different places, in many different kinds of dark rooms where music plays, and people are briefly, imperfectly, but genuinely themselves. But the community that built the underground, that built something in the dark and kept it alive for years, and then, on one night, let it come into the light, demonstrated something that the architecture of oppression was designed to prevent anyone from knowing, that visibility was survivable, that stepping into the street, that making noise, that refusing to go quietly. These were things that people could do and survive. That knowledge, once available, could not be taken back. It circulated, as knowledge in that community always circulated, through the networks that had been built for exactly this purpose. And it grew. Buildings at 51 to 53 Christopher Street. The music played in dark rooms across the country, in bars and apartments and private gatherings and late-night diners that kept their lights on. It played when the police weren't watching, and it played right through the raids in the short time before the floodlights came on. It played while people signed fake names in logbooks and paid for drinks in glasses washed in murky water, and felt, for a few hours, the relief of being somewhere rather than nowhere. And now, it is history, and we remember it. We remember the whispers that spread the knowledge of its existence. We remember the woman who signed the logbook as Judy Garland, and the man who signed as Donald Duck, and the small, quiet defiance embedded in those names. We remember the white floodlights, and what it felt like when they came on. We remember the people in the back room, and the soul music playing. And we remember the night when the floodlights didn't come on, when the warning didn't arrive, when the script broke down, and a woman in handcuffs refused to cooperate with it. We remember all of it, and you can go to sleep now, knowing that the people who walked through that door, the ones who didn't know they were making history, the ones who just needed somewhere to be, are remembered. Their courage is recorded. Their whispers have become archives. Their names, even the pseudonyms, even the Donald Ducks and the Judy Garlands in the logbooks, were part of something that lasted. The music played in dark rooms across the country, in bars and apartments and private gatherings and late-night diners that kept their lights on. It played when the police weren't watching, and it played right through the raids, in the short time before the floodlights came on. It played while people signed fake names in logbooks and paid for drinks in glasses washed in murky water and felt, for a few hours, the relief of being somewhere rather than nowhere. And it is still playing. Different rooms now, many of them with their windows unblocked and their names on the door. But the music is the same, in the sense that matters. It is playing for people who need it. It is playing in spaces that exist, because someone decided the community deserved somewhere to be. This is also where we close out our series on queer spaces. We've spent the last several weeks moving through lesbian bars, gay men's bars, drag bars, bathhouses, bookstores, community centres, and now these hidden rooms and underground corners. The full, complicated, beautiful infrastructure of a community that built itself in the margins and refused to disappear. Thank you for spending these nights with me. Going forward, the channel is moving to a Monday, Wednesday, and Friday schedule. Starting this coming Monday, we're launching a new series, Queer Hollywood, which will air on Mondays and Fridays. And every Wednesday, we'll have a bonus episode from the Queer Icons series. So there's a lot coming, and I hope you'll join me for all of it. Until then, good night. Sleep well. The music played in a dark room, and the world changed. Rest now. We'll be back tomorrow night with the next episode in this series.